All right, welcome to chapter 14 for Bio 246 A and P on the nervous system, spinal cord, and spinal nerves. We're talking today about section 14.1 at the moment. Overview of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. The objectives you should be able to answer after going through this section are to be able to describe the two primary functions of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, describe the general structure of the spinal cord and its four anatomic subdivisions, discuss the naming of the 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and provide a general description of a spinal nerve and its composition, explain how the cauda equina arises during development, and general functions, starting with that. The major functions of the spinal cord and spinal nerves are, number one, it's a structural and a functional link between the brain and the rest of the body. It's the spinal cord's job. Provides sensory input from the body and motor commands from the brain. It receives, I should say, sensory input from the body and motor commands from the brain. Spinal reflexes are the responses that do not involve the brain. They require a fast reaction to a stimulus, so they don't want that stimulus to travel as far, so it comes from the spinal cord. So the spinal cord anatomy, it extends inferiorly from the brain's medulla oblongata through the vertebral canal, four parts of the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, and it ends at L1, the first of the lumbar vertebrae, or vertebra in this case single, with the conus medullaris. And the spinal nerve roots extend inferiorly at the cauda equina. There are two widened regions with a greater number of neurons, the cervical enlargement with neurons innervating the upper limbs, and the lumbar enlargement with the neurons innervating the lower limbs. So we have here, we'll see a closer look for our gross anatomy of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. Here's the medulla oblongata here, and of course right below that we begin our cervical spine, thoracic spine, lumbar spine, and then sacrum and coccyx. That said, these nerves start above C1 technically and end up below C7, which is why you see C1 to C8 as opposed to 7 cervical vertebrae, which there are. It starts above C1 and ends below C7, so end up with 8 of them, and that's why it starts like that. And then T1, T2, and so on are below their thoracic vertebrae going down. So then we have the superior end of the spinal cord, of course, here. The top of the spinal cord above the cervical spine here. There's the cervical plexus here, which will come into play here. That's little area right through here. And this being atlas being C1 here and axis being C2. Cervical enlargement is right here at about C6, right in this area here. The brachial plexus is here. We'll talk more about that, the plexus or the plexi in a little bit here. And T1 vertebra be coming right here, starting out the first one. The posterior median sulcus is here. And of course, here's a lumbosacral enlargement, which is important. We just talked about that briefly. And the conus medullaris, the inferior end of the spinal cord, where the spinal cord ends. And basically from infant or a baby, a small child, the length of the spinal cord which really doesn't change after it's developed. Basically, as an adult, that's the reason why it doesn't reach all the way down. The body may keep growing, but the spinal cord does not after a certain point. And of course here is L1, then the L1 vertebra, with the lumbar going into the sacral part of it, with the nerve root coming through here. And the lumbar plexus is here. And then cauda equina, it's right here about L3. The sacral plexus refers to this area right in here, where crossing over the lumbar on the sacrum here. And the filum terminal here, right here between just about the end of the sacral area there, and the coccyx bone, of course here the tailbone. And looking over here at the conus medullaris and the cauda equina, here's the spinal cord, and there's the posterior rootlets that are all protruding out. Conus medullaris here, we're taking a look, that's right here, basically, right where thoracic spine ends, and lumbar spine technically begins here in this adult spine, that spinal cord ends specifically. And there's posterior root here, posterior root ganglion here. We'll talk more about that. And there's the cauda equina, or equina, if you will, and filum terminal. So the spinal nerve identification and gross anatomy, the nerves are a cable-like bundle of axons with connective tissue wrappings, like we've mentioned before. The epineurium is around the nerve, the perineurium around the fascicle, which is a group of nerves there, and the endoneurium is around the axon, or around a group of axons, I should say, the perineurium, and endoneurium around a single axon. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves having to do with above C1 to down to basically the coccyx, first one. The names begin with the first letter of the spinal cord region to which it attaches, followed by a number. For spinal nerve gross anatomy, the rootlets merge to form roots. The posterior root contains sensory neurons, and the posterior root ganglion contains cell bodies of these neurons. And that's important. The anterior root contains the motor neurons. Each spinal nerve then forms where the roots join, and the sensory and motor neurons in each spinal nerve, so they are classified as mixed nerves. So here we have our posterior rootlets here, and posterior root itself here, the sensory axon here coming through, and the posterior root ganglion. This being the anterior root here, the anterior was the posterior, right? And then we have the spinal nerve here, basically the effectors coming more to the anterior, and the sensory receptors, the posterior, right? The somatic, the tactile receptors, proprioceptors, and the visceral, the baroreceptors, and chemoreceptors, which we'll talk more about when we get to more greater depth in that area later on. And as far as the effectors, the visceral, from the autonomic peripheral nervous system, the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and the glands, and the somatic from the skeletal muscle, all come into the anterior portion here of our spinal nerve. So, what did you learn? What are the two primary functions of the spinal cord and spinal nerves? What are the general shape, diameter, and length of the spinal cord, and where is it housed? What's the total number of spinal nerves, and how are they specifically identified? And how is that cauda equina formed, and what composes the cauda equina? For 14.2, we're talking about protection and support of the spinal cord. You should be able to, when going through this section, discuss the relationship of the spinal cord and spinal nerve to the vertebral column, describe the locations and functions of the spinal cord meninges, and compare and contrast the three spaces associated with the spinal cord meninges. So, when we're talking about protection and support of the spinal cord, it's protected by bone, the meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid. The vertebral column houses the spinal cord. This cord passes through the vertebral canal, and each spinal nerve exits through an invertebral foramen, or intervertebral foramen. The spinal cord meninges, we have, just as before, as we referred to with nerves in general, we have the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and we have the dura mater. We refer to meninges is the brain, I should say. The pia mater is the delicate layer adhering to the spinal cord, the deepest layer made of elastic and collagen fibers. The denticulate ligaments are lateral extensions of the pia to help suspend the spinal cord. And the filum terminal is the pia anchoring inferior end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. The arachnoid mater is a web-like layer. It's external to the pia. The arachnoid trabeculae are fibrous extensions of the membrane. The subarachnoid space, which we talked about before, with the brain, is the area deep to the arachnoid through which the cerebrospinal fluid flows, just like it did with the brain. The dura mater, a tough outermost layer, is one layer of dense regular connective tissue that stabilizes the spinal cord, and the subdural space is between the dura and the arachnoid, and the epidural space, where a pregnant woman will get an epidural before having given birth to avoid significant pain. That's where it goes. That's why it's called getting an epidural. It's between the dura and the vertebra. It houses the adipose or areolar connective tissue and blood vessels. So here we have a picture of our cross-section of our vertebra and the spinal cord, posterior and the anterior. We have the spinous process of the vertebra here. This is the one that, of course, that looks like a giraffe, right? You should be able to know which vertebra that is. And we have epidural space here of the dura mater right there, a little more deeper to that. Then denticulate ligament here coming through for that spinal nerve. The subdural space is more here with the arachnoid mater. There, not hard to tell right button there, a little more minute here. There's subarachnoid space here, the pia mater there, and of course we have our spinal cord itself with our white matter and the gray matter, right? And that butterfly shape, which we'll talk about here. Again, with the anterior, the posterior, the nerve root there, and the lateral, which we'll talk about here shortly. And with the intervertebral foramen here, that'll be important later on as well. And a little bit better anterior view of our spinal cord here with our white matter and our gray matter internally. And we have our posterior median sulcus, and then we have our central canal right there, right for the cerebral spinal fluid here, and the anterior median fissure, and our pia mater there. Our posterior rootlets all coming emanating here. The posterior root itself, the posterior root ganglion, right, and of course. That's where I should say the posterior root ganglion referring more to here, and the spinal nerve here, and the anterior root coming out here, the anterior versus posterior, and the anterior rootlets, right? And we have our subarachnoid space between here and arachnoid mater, the subdural space, which showing the different layers here, right? And the dura mater. So if we're going to be going from most superficial to deep, we go dura mater, subdural space, the arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space from there. Now, lumbar puncture is one of those, again, those areas of importance for application. Down the road is vital for knowing. For the short term, not so vital because we have to get the basic terminology, basic concepts down first to fully understand what that means for some of these applications. But as a foreshadowing of stuff you're going to need to know, of course, lumbar puncture is a procedure for obtaining cerebrospinal fluid for medical diagnosis. I remember the first time I got to see one was when my dad was in the hospital for acute myeloid leukemia, and it was very scary. And then getting to see one done, and it was done with a student doing it with the doctor supervising. And so the first time a person ever done it on my dad. Luckily, he was well anesthetized, of course, but I could hear everything, and I was watching it, and I could hear it crunching and noises for someone who didn't really know exactly what to do and where to go. It was a little bit unnerving, to say the least, no pun intended there. But yeah, it should be fairly straightforward. And when the doctor does it, it's very straightforward. If you're ever in that position, I'm sure for you, it'll be very straightforward. It was definitely a little nerve-wracking for me witnessing it at that time. The needle passes through the skin, the back muscles, the ligamentum flavum, the epidural space, the dura mater, and the arachnoid mater into the subarachnoid space. The adult spinal cord, of course, ends at L1, and the lumbar puncture is below this, just below it, but it's just above or below L4. And the spinous process of L4 at the highest points of the iliac crest. So what did you learn? Where are the epidural, subdural, and the subarachnoid spaces located? Where are they located, excuse me? And which space contains the cerebrospinal fluid? And we'll come back for section 14.3 with anatomy of the spinal cord and spinal roots shortly.